At the inheritance meeting, my sister smirked and announced, "Mom and Dad are giving me all 8 rental properties in Florida. Tessa, you get nothing." Everyone applauded. I didn't react, I just smiled and said, "Dad, you honestly don't know, do you?" His face went white. My sister snapped, panicked. "No what?" The mahogany conference table shimmered beneath the cold fluorescent lights, reflecting the polished facades of my family as they drifted into the attorney's office. Their designer clothes rustled, a symphony of their self-importance. My sister, Natalie, swept in last, her Louis Vuitton bag swinging with the confident swagger of a conqueror, her husband, Derek, and their 2 teenagers, Madison and Colton, trailing in her wake. My parents, Joanne and Richard, claimed their seats at the head of the table, their faces set in expressions of practiced neutrality, a veneer so thin, it fooled no one, least of all me. I sat alone on the opposite side, deliberately, consciously, in a simple navy dress I'd bought on clearance 3 years ago. The contrast wasn't accidental. Every detail of this day, this gathering, felt meticulously orchestrated to underscore my diminished place in this family's immutable hierarchy. Attorney William Garrett, a thin man whose wire-rimmed glasses perched precariously on his nose, shuffled papers at the head of the table. He'd navigated my family's legal affairs for 2 decades, and even he, a master of dispassion, seemed to sense the ugliness about to unfold. His voice, when he finally spoke, was tight. "Shall we begin?" My father nodded, his silver hair catching the unforgiving light. At 68, Richard Brennan still carried himself with the rigid authority of the corporate executive he'd been before retirement. My mother, Joanne, beside him, her face a testament to expensive dermatologists and the emotional distance she'd meticulously cultivated between us for as long as I could remember, offered no warmth. "As you all know," Mr. Garrett began, his gaze sweeping over us, "we're here today to discuss the distribution of the Brennan family real estate holdings, specifically the 8 rental properties located in various Florida locations." Natalie, unable to contain her eagerness, leaned forward. "Can we skip the formalities? Everyone knows what's happening here." My mother's hand instinctively found Natalie's arm, a gesture of unwavering solidarity that sent a familiar, dull ache through my chest. Even after 34 years, their united front still held the power to wound me. "Natalie," my father admonished, his tone carrying a warning that lacked any real force. But my sister was already on her feet, her perfectly manicured hands pressed flat against the mahogany. "Mom and Dad are giving all 8 rental houses in Florida to me. Tessa, too bad. You're getting nothing." Her words hung in the air, a venomous pronouncement. I watched as Derek offered an approving nod, Madison smirked openly in my direction, and Colton, oblivious, scrolled through his phone. My parents' silence was its own form of damning confirmation. Then the applause. My Aunt Pamela, my mother's younger sister, actually started clapping. Uncle George joined in, his claps echoing thinly. My cousins, 3 of them perched along the wall like spectators at a blood sport, added their voices to the grotesque celebration. The sound of their approval reverberated through the conference room, a triumphant chorus validating my systematic exclusion from the very family I had spent my entire life yearning to belong to. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded calmly in my lap, my expression an unreadable mask. Months of preparation, of rehearsing this moment, had compressed the white-hot anger and the familiar ache of hurt into something cold, potent, and useful. When the applause finally faded, I smiled. The expression felt foreign on my face, but I had practiced it in the mirror until it looked genuine, even serene. "Dad," I said, my voice steady, clear, cutting through the smug quiet. "You really don't know, do you?" My father's face transformed. The color drained from his cheeks so quickly I genuinely thought he might faint. His hands, which had rested so comfortably on the table moments before, began to tremble. His eyes, which had studiously avoided mine throughout the meeting, suddenly locked onto my face with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. The room went silent. Even Aunt Pamela's triumphant smirk faltered. Natalie's voice sliced through the tension like a serrated knife. "Now what?" I let her question hang in the air, savoring the profound shift in power that had just occurred in the span of a single sentence. For my entire life, I had been the family scapegoat, the disappointment, the daughter who could never quite measure up to perfect Natalie. Today, the scales would finally balance. Perhaps, I said, reaching into my bag, we should start from the beginning. Growing up in the Brennan household meant understanding your role and staying meticulously within its confines. Natalie was the golden child, the firstborn, the daughter who could do no wrong. She'd inherited our mother's delicate features and our father's sharp intellect, and she wielded both like finely honed weapons from the moment she could speak. I arrived 4 years later, an unplanned pregnancy my mother never quite let me forget. Where Natalie was fair and willowy, I was dark-haired and sturdy. Where she excelled effortlessly, I struggled for every achievement. Where she received praise and adoration, I received criticism and indifference. The divide widened, becoming an insurmountable chasm by our teenage years. Natalie discovered she could blame me for anything and be believed implicitly. A dent in her car? Tessa must have taken it without permission. Missing jewelry? Check Tessa's room. A failed test? Tessa distracted her while she was studying. Our parents never questioned these accusations. They had already decided which daughter was worthy of their trust, and no amount of evidence, no desperate plea from my end, could change their minds. At 18, I left for college with a suitcase full of second-hand clothes and an unshakable determination to build a life entirely separate from the family that had so thoroughly rejected me. While Natalie attended a prestigious private university on our parents' generous dime, I worked 3 jobs to put myself through state school. She graduated debt-free with a degree in marketing. I earned my accounting degree with $50,000 in student loans and a work ethic forged in sheer exhaustion. The disparity continued into adulthood. When Natalie married Derek Holloway, a real estate developer with inherited wealth, our parents threw them a wedding that cost more than my annual salary. When I married Michael Chen, a software engineer I met through mutual friends, our parents sent a card with a $200 check and their regrets that they couldn't attend. Michael and I built our life together, brick by painstaking brick. We bought a modest house in a quiet suburb, saved diligently, and welcomed our daughter, Emma, into the world when I was 29. My parents visited once, stayed for 3 hours, and spent most of that time comparing Emma unfavorably to Natalie's children. "She's so dark," my mother observed, examining my daughter like a specimen under a microscope. "Does Michael's family all have that coloring?" I stopped inviting them after that. The silence that followed felt less like a loss and more like a quiet liberation. The Florida properties entered the picture when I was 32. My father had made a series of shrewd investments during the housing crisis years earlier, purchasing 8 distressed properties in various Florida beach communities. Over the following years, those properties appreciated dramatically while generating substantial rental income. Conservative estimates placed their combined value at roughly $4 million. During a rare, strained family dinner, my father announced his intention to leave all 8 properties to Natalie and Derek. His reasoning was simplistic, almost insulting. Derek was in real estate and would know how to manage them. I was an accountant. What did I know about property management? Besides, my mother added, her voice laced with that particular tone she reserved for discussions of my inadequacy, "Natalie has 2 children to provide for. You only have Emma." Michael squeezed my hand under the table, a silent, comforting reminder that we didn't need their approval or their money. We drove home in silence that night, and I cried for the last time over my parents' rejection. What none of them knew, however, was that my accounting career had taken an interesting turn. 5 years earlier, I transitioned from general accounting to a forensic accounting firm specializing in fraud investigation. My analytical mind and unwavering attention to detail made me excellent at uncovering financial deceptions, and I'd built a quiet reputation for finding discrepancies that others missed. I never intended to investigate my own family. The discovery was accidental, born from a casual conversation at another awkward family gathering. It happened 18 months before today's inheritance meeting. Natalie was bragging about Derek's latest project, a luxury condominium development that had just broken ground. My father, predictably, was nodding along, impressed as always by his favorite son-in-law's entrepreneurial spirit. "The investors are thrilled," Derek said, his voice carrying that particular smugness I'd grown to despise. "We've already pre-sold 60% of the units." Something in his tone, a subtle discordant note, triggered my professional instincts. After years of investigating fraud, I developed a sensitivity to the subtle tells that preceded financial deception, the way Derek avoided specific numbers, the vague references to unnamed investors, the slight tension around his eyes when my father asked about projected returns. I filed the observation away and for a time forgot about it. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, when I stumbled across a news article about a similar development project that had collapsed spectacularly in another state, that those observations resurfaced. But before I explain what I found, you need to understand just how deep the favoritism ran in our family. It wasn't just about money or attention, it was systematic, calculated, and utterly devastating to a child who simply wanted to be loved. When Natalie was 16, she crashed my father's Mercedes into a mailbox while driving without a license. Our parents paid for the repairs, smoothed things over with the neighbors, and never mentioned it again. When I was 16, I accidentally scratched the bumper of my mother's sedan while learning to parallel park during a driving lesson she had insisted upon. She brought it up at every family gathering for the next 5 years, citing it as irrefutable evidence of my carelessness and irresponsibility. Natalie shoplifted a designer bracelet from a department store during her senior year of high school. Our father called in a favor with a friend who worked there, and the incident vanished from existence. When I was caught with a library book I'd forgotten to return, my mother lectured me about theft and moral character for an entire weekend. The examples multiplied endlessly throughout our childhood. Natalie received a car for her 18th birthday, a gleaming red convertible that she promptly crashed twice within the first year. I received a card with a $20 bill and a reminder that I should start saving for my own vehicle if I wanted one. Natalie's college applications were handled by an expensive private consultant our parents hired. I filled out my applications alone at the kitchen table after my shifts at the grocery store, using fee waivers because I couldn't afford the submission costs. Even our physical spaces reflected the hierarchy. Natalie's bedroom was twice the size of mine, boasting an ensuite bathroom and a walk-in closet. I slept in what had originally been a home office, my clothes crammed into a narrow wardrobe that my father complained about whenever he needed to retrieve old files. When I tentatively asked about switching rooms, my mother looked at me as though I'd suggested we burn the house down. "Natalie needs her space," she explained, as though this were self-evident. "She has friends over. She has activities. You just sit in your room and read." The message was deafeningly clear. Natalie's needs mattered because Natalie mattered. My needs were mere inconveniences to be minimized. Michael was the first person who helped me see my family clearly, with an outsider's unclouded perspective. We'd been dating for 6 months when he attended his first Brennan family dinner. Afterward, he sat in his car for 20 minutes, visibly shaken, unable to articulate what he'd witnessed. "They treat you like a servant," he finally said, his voice thick with suppressed anger. "Your mother asked you to clear the dishes 4 separate times. She didn't ask Natalie once. Natalie was talking to Dad about her promotion. You got a promotion last month. Did anyone ask about it?" I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it. No one had asked? I'd mentioned it briefly when we first arrived, and my mother had nodded vaguely before redirecting the conversation to Natalie's latest accomplishment. "That's just how they are," I said weakly. "That's not an excuse," Michael retorted, his gaze unwavering. "That's abuse." Abuse. I'd never thought of it in those terms before. Abuse conjured images of violence, of screaming matches, of physical wounds. My parents never hit me. They rarely even raised their voices. Their cruelty was quieter, more insidious. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one small enough to be dismissed individually, but devastating in aggregate. Michael's blunt assessment began to shift something fundamental inside me. I started keeping a mental tally of the slights, the dismissals, the moments where my parents' favoritism was so blatant it would have been comical if it weren't so profoundly painful. Natalie received a down payment for her first house. I received a fruit basket. Natalie's children were showered with expensive gifts at Christmas. Emma received a single, modest present, always clearly an afterthought. Natalie was consulted on family decisions, invited to planning sessions, treated as a valued participant in the family's future. I learned about major announcements secondhand, often weeks after everyone else. The worst moment came when Emma was 3. We gathered at my parents' house for Easter, and Madison and Colton were hunting for eggs in the expansive backyard while Emma toddled behind them, too young to understand the game, but utterly delighted by the colorful decorations. I watched as Madison deliberately stepped on an egg Emma had been reaching for, crushing it beneath her designer sneakers, and laughing when Emma's joyous babbling turned into a tearful wail. "Madison!" I said sharply, moving toward my daughter. "That wasn't kind." My sister materialized beside me before I could reach Emma. "Don't you dare discipline my child. She just crushed an egg Emma was trying to pick up on purpose. Emma needs to learn that life isn't fair," Natalie said, her voice chillingly calm. "She can't always get what she wants." I stared at Natalie, searching for some sign that she recognized the bitter irony of her statement. She gazed back with perfect serenity, utterly convinced of her righteousness. "She's 3 years old, Natalie. And Madison is teaching her an important lesson." My mother appeared at Natalie's shoulder, her expression making unmistakably clear which side she'd chosen. "Tessa, don't make a scene. It's Easter." I collected Emma and left within the hour. Michael met us in the driveway, having witnessed the exchange from the kitchen window. He didn't say anything. He just held Emma while I sat in the passenger seat and stared at the house I'd grown up in, finally accepting that it had never truly been my home. That was the last holiday we spent with my family. The arrangement was gradual rather than dramatic. I stopped initiating contact, and they barely noticed. Months would pass without a phone call. When we did speak, the conversations were brief and superficial, my mother filling the silence with updates about Natalie's life while expressing zero curiosity about mine. Emma barely knew her grandparents, and I made peace with that reality. Better to have no grandparents than to have grandparents who would teach her she was worth less than her cousins. 2 years after that Easter incident, I made my accidental discovery about Derek. By then, Emma had just turned 5, and I was operating from a position of emotional distance I'd carefully cultivated. I no longer expected my parents to believe me, which made their rejection easier to bear. I no longer hoped Natalie might choose sisterhood over self-interest, which made her threats less wounding than they might have been. But their response to my discovery still clarified something profoundly important. They weren't just favoring Natalie out of habit or unconscious bias. They were actively choosing to believe lies over truth, to protect a criminal over their own daughter. That choice had consequences, and I was finally ready to let those consequences unfold. The news article about the collapsed development project had detailed how the developer had been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, using new investor money to pay returns to earlier investors while siphoning off millions for personal use. My curiosity, sparked by Derek's bragging, now compelled me. Using public records and my professional database access, I began a quiet investigation into Derek Holloway's business dealings. What I found was devastating. Derek's company, Holloway Development Group, had been operating as a shell game for nearly a decade. He was borrowing against properties he didn't own, fabricating investor reports, and using new project funds to cover shortfalls in older developments. The condo project he'd been bragging about was particularly egregious. It had no genuine financing, no legitimate permits, and no actual construction plans. The investors were mostly elderly retirees who'd been promised guaranteed returns on their retirement savings. But the discovery that truly stopped my heart was buried in a labyrinthine web of subsidiary companies and offshore accounts. Derek had been systematically stealing from my parents' Florida rental properties for 7 years. He'd convinced my father to give him management authority over the portfolio, ostensibly to handle maintenance and tenant relations. Instead, he'd been diverting rental income into his failing developments, forging expense reports, and gradually depleting the equity through fraudulent refinancing. The 8 properties my parents planned to leave to Natalie were leveraged to their breaking point. They owed more in liens and second mortgages than they were worth. Derek had extracted roughly $4.5 million from my parents through fraudulent refinancing and diverted rental income, leaving them with properties collectively worth negative $400,000. My first instinct, despite everything they'd done to me, was to tell them immediately. I couldn't watch my parents be victimized by someone they trusted. I drafted an email, meticulously organized the evidence, and prepared to expose Derek's crimes. Then I made the mistake of calling Natalie. I thought, naively, that she would want to know her husband was a criminal. I thought maternal instinct might overcome her lifelong animosity toward me. I thought wrong. "You're lying," she said, her voice flat and cold. "You're just jealous because Mom and Dad love me more. You've always been jealous. Natalie, I have documentation. Bank records, forged signatures, offshore transfers. Derek has been stealing from our parents for years. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, I will destroy you. I'll tell everyone you fabricated evidence because you're mentally unstable. Mom and Dad will believe me. They always do." She hung up before I could respond. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after the call ended, cycling through emotions I couldn't quite name. Disappointment, certainly. Anger, without question. But beneath those familiar feelings was something new, clarity. For years I'd wondered if perhaps I was being oversensitive, if maybe my perception of the family dynamics was distorted by my own insecurities. Natalie's response obliterated any remaining doubt. She knew. On some level, whether she'd admitted it to herself or not, she knew her husband was a fraud. Her immediate defensiveness, her swift leap to threats rather than questions, the complete absence of surprise in her voice, all of it pointed to a woman protecting a secret rather than defending an innocent man. She had chosen her lifestyle over the truth, her comfort over justice, her position in the family hierarchy over everything else. Michael found me still holding the phone an hour later. When I explained what had happened, his jaw tightened in that familiar way it did when he was fighting to control his temper. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I'm not going to let this go." He nodded slowly. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. But Tessa, be careful. These people have shown you exactly who they are. They'll fight dirty if they feel cornered." He was right, of course. Michael had a gift for cutting through emotional complexity to identify practical realities. Natalie would absolutely fight dirty. She'd spent her entire life competing with me, even when there was no competition to be had. Now that I genuinely threatened her position, she would deploy every weapon at her disposal. I spent the next several days considering my options. Going to my parents directly would be futile. Natalie had certainly poisoned that well beyond recovery. Approaching Derek himself was pointless and potentially dangerous. The authorities were an option, but I knew how slowly those wheels turned, and I lacked confidence that my evidence would be taken seriously by investigators who didn't know me. What I needed was more documentation, more proof, enough evidence to make the case undeniable, to remove any possibility that my findings could be dismissed as the jealous fabrications of a bitter sibling. 3 days later, my mother called to inform me that Natalie had shared my delusional accusations with the family. They had decided it would be best if I didn't attend the upcoming Thanksgiving gathering. My father got on the line briefly to express his disappointment that I would stoop to such desperate measures to undermine my sister's marriage. "We've given you every opportunity," he said, his voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. "I don't know where we went wrong with you, Tessa." The phone went dead, and something inside me went dead with it. The last thread of hope I'd been clinging to, the belief that somewhere beneath their favoritism, my parents still loved me, finally snapped. I sat in my home office for hours that night, staring at the evidence I'd compiled. Michael found me there after midnight, my face streaked with dried tears, my hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. "What do you want to do?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. I want them to know the truth. They already do. They chose not to believe it. He was right. My parents had been presented with evidence of fraud and had chosen their preferred narrative instead. Natalie had been warned and had threatened me rather than confront reality. They'd made their choices. Now I would make mine. The following months tested my resolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. Building a federal case while maintaining the appearance of normalcy required a compartmentalization I'd never attempted before. At work, I was the consummate professional, handling my regular caseload while quietly coordinating with investigators who found my preliminary research invaluable. At home, I was present for Emma and Michael, determined that my family's toxicity wouldn't contaminate the life we built together. But late at night, when the house was quiet and my daughter was sleeping peacefully down the hall, I would sit in my home office and piece together the full scope of Derek's betrayal. The work was meticulous and often tedious, following money through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts, documenting each fraudulent transaction with the precision my profession demanded. I discovered things I hadn't even been looking for. Derek's fraud extended far beyond my parents' properties, into a network of victims spanning 3 states, elderly couples who trusted him with their retirement funds, small investors who'd scraped together savings for what they believed were guaranteed returns, a widower who'd given Derek his late wife's life insurance payout, hoping to build something for his grandchildren's education. Each new victim I identified strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about my family anymore. Derek was a predator, and Natalie was either his accomplice or his willing enabler. The FBI agents I worked with grew increasingly interested as the scope of the fraud became clear, assigning additional resources to what had started as my personal investigation. One evening, about 8 months into the process, Michael joined me in my office. He'd been patiently supportive throughout this ordeal, never questioning my commitment to seeing it through, but I could see the concern etched in his features. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I'm fine. The investigation is progressing faster than I expected." "That's not what I asked?" I paused, setting down the document I'd been reviewing. Michael had always seen through my deflections. "It's strange," I admitted. "I thought this would feel more satisfying. Gathering all this evidence, watching the case build, but mostly I just feel tired." "You're grieving." The word caught me off guard. "Grieving what? I've known who my family was for years. Knowing and accepting are different things. You're finally closing a door you kept hoping might open." He was right, as usual. Some stubborn part of me had held on to the fantasy that my parents might eventually recognize their mistake, might wake up one morning and see me clearly for the first time. The investigation had killed that fantasy as thoroughly as it would eventually destroy Derek's freedom. "They're going to lose everything," I said quietly. "Not just the properties, their retirement, their social standing, their image of themselves as good people who raised good daughters. Do they deserve to keep those things?" I considered the question seriously. Did my parents deserve to maintain their comfortable delusions? They'd enabled Derek for years, not through malice, but through the same willful blindness they'd applied to every uncomfortable truth about their golden child. They'd chosen ignorance, and ignorance had costs. "No," I finally answered. "They don't?" Michael reached across the desk and squeezed my hand. "Then stop feeling guilty about consequences they earned." It was exactly what I needed to hear. The lingering guilt I'd been carrying, the sense that perhaps I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, too determined to see them suffer, evaporated in the face of his simple logic. I hadn't created this situation. I'd simply refused to participate in the family tradition of looking the other way. The investigation accelerated after that conversation. I threw myself into the work with renewed focus, and the federal team matched my energy. By month 12, they had enough to move forward with arrests, but they held back, wanting to build the strongest possible case. By month 15, Derek's entire network had been mapped, his accomplices identified, his victims catalogued. The arrest warrant was issued on a Tuesday morning. I learned about it through an encrypted message from the lead investigator, a woman named Special Agent Carolyn Pierce, who had become something like a friend over our months of collaboration. She thanked me for my contribution and promised to keep me informed as events unfolded. I sat at my desk that morning, staring at her message, and felt nothing. Not triumph, not relief, not sadness, just a profound emptiness where emotions should have been. Derek Holloway was about to lose his freedom. My sister's life was about to collapse. My parents were about to discover that their favorite daughter had married a monster they defended while alienating the daughter who tried to protect them. And all I could think about was what to make Emma for breakfast. The investigation spanned 18 months. I worked quietly, methodically, building a case that couldn't be dismissed as the ravings of a jealous sister. I brought my findings to the FBI field office in our city, presenting them to agents who were initially skeptical but grew increasingly interested as they verified my research. My evidence connected Derek's schemes to a larger network of corrupt developers and complicit financial institutions that federal investigators had been trying to crack for years. My documentation gave them the missing pieces they needed. I also did something else. Something that required setting aside the accountant's ethical training I'd internalized for decades. I documented everything about my family's treatment of me. Every slight, every rejection, every instance where they'd chosen Natalie over truth. I compiled emails, text messages, and detailed notes from conversations. I built a parallel case alongside the criminal one, a record of systematic emotional abuse that spanned my entire lifetime. The FBI moved faster than I expected. 6 weeks before the inheritance meeting, they arrested Derek on 17 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and elder abuse. The news coverage was extensive. His face appeared on local stations across Florida, identified as the mastermind of a scheme that had defrauded dozens of retirees out of their life savings. My parents weren't mentioned in the initial coverage. I'd asked the investigators to keep their names out of the press, framing it as concern for their privacy. The truth was more complicated. I wanted to be present when they learned the full extent of what Derek had done to them. I wanted to watch their faces when they realized they defended a criminal while rejecting their own daughter. The inheritance meeting was my idea. I suggested it through Aunt Pamela, knowing she would present it as her own brilliant notion, a formal gathering to finalize the property distribution, complete with extended family to witness Natalie's triumph. The whole clan assembled to celebrate my exclusion. They had no idea what was coming. Mr. Garrett's face had gone pale as I placed the manila folder on the conference table. The room's earlier celebratory energy had curdled into something thick and anxious. My father still hadn't moved, his hands frozen in mid-tremor, his eyes fixed on the folder, as if it might explode. "What is that?" my mother demanded, her voice sharp with a kind of aggression she reserved for moments when she felt her control slipping. "Documentation," I said simply. "Dad, did Derek ever mention the refinancing he arranged for the Tampa property? What about the Jacksonville duplex, the Pensacola beachfront?" My father's jaw worked soundlessly. Beside him, Natalie had gone still as a statue. Her earlier smugness was replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "He had my power of attorney," my father finally managed, his voice a reedy whisper. "For convenience. The properties are complicated. They're not complicated anymore. They're worthless." I opened the folder and spread the documents across the table. Loan agreements, transfer records, forged signatures, offshore account statements. Derek mortgaged every property to its maximum value, then diverted the funds into shell companies that funneled money into his personal accounts. The rental income you thought you were receiving? Fabricated. The maintenance expenses you were paying? Inflated or invented entirely. "This is ridiculous," Natalie snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. "Derek would never. Derek is currently in federal custody awaiting trial on 17 counts of fraud. His arrest was covered extensively on the evening news. Perhaps you've been too busy to watch television lately." The silence that followed was profound. I watched my family process the information, their faces cycling through denial, confusion, and dawning horror. My mother's hand found my father's, gripping so tightly her knuckles went white. The 8 properties you were planning to give Natalie are collectively worth negative $400,000. Derek borrowed against equity that didn't exist, using forged appraisals and complicit loan officers. When the FBI finishes their investigation, there's a strong possibility the properties will be seized as part of his asset recovery. No. My father's voice cracked on the single syllable. No, I would have known. The statements, the reports, were all fabricated by Derek's company. I have the originals from the banks. Dad, I can show you exactly where the money went and when. My father aged a decade in front of my eyes. His shoulders collapsed inward, his commanding presence shrinking into something fragile and broken. My mother's face had gone blank with shock, her social armor finally failing her. Natalie found her voice first, but it emerged strangled and desperate. You did this! You're trying to frame Derek because you hate me. Because you've always hated me. I discovered the fraud 18 months ago, Natalie. I called you. I tried to warn you. Do you remember what you said? Her face drained of color. You threatened to destroy me. You told Mom and Dad I was mentally unstable, that I'd fabricated evidence out of jealousy. You convinced them to exclude me from Thanksgiving because I dared to tell the truth about your husband. The extended family shifted uncomfortably. Aunt Pamela's smug satisfaction had transformed into something closer to nausea. My cousins exchanged nervous glances, suddenly aware that they'd cheered for the wrong team. I gave you a chance, I continued, my voice steady, despite the emotion churning beneath it. I gave our parents a chance. You chose Derek. You chose the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth. You chose your golden child narrative over evidence from your own daughter. Tessa. My mother's voice was barely a whisper. You have to understand, we didn't know. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. I gathered the documents back into the folder and stood. The room watched me in stunned silence, my family frozen in various poses of devastation. The federal investigators have everything they need. Derek will likely spend the next 15 to 20 years in prison. His victims, including you, may eventually recover some portion of their losses through the asset seizure process. But those 8 properties you were so proud of? They're gone. I turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Natalie, the FBI is also investigating whether you had knowledge of Derek's schemes. Those luxury purchases you've been making, the ones that seem inconsistent with your stated income? They're very interested in where that money came from. I should mention that I kept detailed notes of our phone conversation 18 months ago, the one where you threatened to destroy me rather than ask a single question about the evidence I'd found. The prosecutors found your reaction quite telling. Your attorney should be expecting a subpoena. Natalie's scream followed me into the hallway, a raw sound of fury and fear that echoed off the polished walls of the law firm. The aftermath unfolded exactly as I'd anticipated. Derek pleaded guilty to 14 counts in exchange for a reduced sentence. He received 12 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay restitution that he would never be able to satisfy. Natalie divorced him 6 months later, though the investigation into her potential involvement dragged on for another year. My documented notes of her threatening phone call suggested consciousness of guilt, but prosecutors ultimately decided that proving she had specific knowledge of the fraud's details would be difficult to establish beyond reasonable doubt. She escaped criminal charges, though the investigation itself became a matter of public record that followed her everywhere. My parents lost everything. The Florida properties were seized. Their retirement accounts were frozen during the investigation, and the legal fees consumed what little remained. They sold their house and moved into a small apartment, their lifestyle reduced from comfortable affluence to modest uncertainty. Natalie's children, Madison and Colton, both turned against her. They'd grown up in luxury built on stolen money, and the public humiliation of their father's arrest followed them everywhere. Madison moved across the country for college and rarely returned. Colton dropped out of his private school and bounced between relatives who grew increasingly reluctant to house him. The extended family scattered like roaches when the lights came on. Aunt Pamela suddenly remembered urgent business in another state. Uncle George developed health issues that prevented him from attending family functions. The cousins who had applauded my exclusion began reaching out with awkward apologies and transparent attempts to rebuild bridges they'd enthusiastically burned. I ignored them all. The months following Derek's arrest brought a cascade of revelations that even I hadn't fully anticipated. His cooperation with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence meant that the full scope of his crimes became public record. Court documents detailed schemes stretching back over a decade, and journalists eager for scandal dug up every sordid detail. My parents' names appeared in several articles, not as victims, but as unwitting participants in Derek's money laundering. He'd used their Florida properties as collateral for loans he never intended to repay, forging their signatures and fabricating their consent. The revelation that they'd been manipulated by their own son-in-law became a source of public embarrassment that my mother, in particular, found intolerable. I heard through Aunt Pamela, who suddenly remembered my phone number when she needed someone to process her shock, that my mother had attempted to contest the fraud charges, insisting that Derek must have been framed. Even with his guilty plea on record, even with his own testimony confirming years of theft, she couldn't accept that she'd been deceived. The alternative was admitting she'd been wrong, and that was simply beyond her capacity. My father handled the aftermath differently. According to the fragments of information that reached me, he withdrew almost entirely from social life. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and dominated family gatherings now spent his days in their small apartment watching television and avoiding phone calls. Aunt Pamela described him as broken, a word that landed with surprising force. I examined my reaction to his suffering and found it muted, distant. Some part of me recognized that he was still my father, that the man falling apart in that apartment had once carried me on his shoulders and taught me to ride a bicycle. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a different version of myself who still believed love could be earned through effort and excellence. The father in those memories had been replaced gradually, and then all at once, by the man who'd called me a disappointment for trying to protect him. That man had made his choices, and now he lived with their consequences. Natalie proved more resilient than I'd expected, or perhaps just more shameless. Her divorce from Derek was finalized within the year, and she immediately began reconstructing her public image. Social media posts emphasized her status as a victim, her courage in leaving a difficult marriage, her determination to rebuild her life as a single mother. She never mentioned Derek's crimes. She never acknowledged her role in silencing me. The narrative she crafted was one of innocent betrayal, a trusting wife deceived by a man she'd loved. Those who knew the truth kept silent, and those who didn't offered sympathy and support. Her children complicated the story. Madison, who had always been closest to Derek, struggled to reconcile her father's imprisonment with her image of him as an invincible provider. She lashed out at Natalie, blaming her for not knowing, for not protecting them, for allowing their family to become a cautionary tale whispered at country clubs and school fundraisers. By the time she left for college, their relationship had deteriorated beyond repair. Colton's path was messy. Without Derek's money funding his private school education, he transferred to a public high school where his family name carried stigma rather than status. He fell in with a crowd that matched his newfound anger, and his grades plummeted accordingly. Last I heard, he was working at a restaurant, having dropped out during his senior year, despite Natalie's protests. My parents attempted reconciliation several times. My father sent a handwritten letter that managed to apologize for the inheritance situation, while still implying that my investigation had been excessive. My mother called once, her voice brittle with pride she couldn't quite swallow, offering to move past this unpleasantness, if I would just be reasonable. I wasn't interested in being reasonable. I'd spent my whole life being reasonable while they treated me as lesser. I tried to warn them, tried to protect them, and they'd responded by calling me delusional and excluding me from family gatherings. They didn't deserve my forgiveness, and I no longer felt obligated to offer it. Emma turned 7 the spring after the inheritance meeting. She'd been 5 when I first discovered the fraud, 6 during most of the investigation, and now she was growing into a bright, confident child who knew nothing of the family drama that had consumed my attention for nearly 2 years. Michael and I threw her a birthday party in our backyard, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become our chosen family. I watched my daughter blow out her candles, her face bright with joy, and felt something settle in my chest. I hadn't inherited property or money from my parents. I hadn't received their approval or their love. But I'd built something better. A marriage based on partnership rather than power. A home filled with warmth rather than competition. A daughter who would never have to doubt whether she was good enough because we would make sure she knew her worth every single day. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I glanced at it briefly before returning my attention to Emma. Tessa, it's Natalie. I need to talk to you. Please, I'm sorry for everything. I blocked the number and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Some bridges, once burned, should stay that way. 3 years have passed since that day in the attorney's office. I've been promoted twice at my firm, my work on the Holloway case earning me a reputation as one of the foremost forensic accountants in the region. Michael's company went public, and our financial situation improved dramatically. Emma started 4th grade last month, now 10 years old, and already showing signs of the analytical mind that runs in my side of the family. My parents live quietly now, their social circle diminished to near invisibility. I hear updates occasionally through distant relatives who still feel the need to keep me informed. My father's health has declined. My mother volunteers at a church thrift shop. They become cautionary tales whispered at family reunions they no longer attend. Natalie remarried last year, a man I'd never met. The wedding was small, nothing like the lavish affair our parents had thrown for her first marriage. I wasn't invited, which was fine. I wouldn't have attended anyway. Some people wonder how I can be at peace with the destruction of my family. They don't understand that my family was destroyed long before that meeting. It was destroyed every time my parents chose Natalie over truth. Every time they dismissed my achievements while celebrating hers. Every time they made me feel like an unwanted guest in my own home. What happened in that conference room wasn't destruction. It was exposure. The rot had always been there, hidden beneath expensive furniture and practiced smiles. I simply showed everyone what it looked like. I don't regret it. I don't feel guilty. I feel free. For the first time in my life, I'm no longer the family disappointment. I'm no longer the sister who couldn't measure up. I'm no longer the daughter begging for approval from people who were never going to give it. I'm simply Tessa, accountant, wife, mother. A woman who discovered that the greatest inheritance isn't property or money. It's the knowledge that you're worthy of love and respect, regardless of whether your family agrees. They never gave me that inheritance. I claimed it anyway.